How fantastic, like to have a full room talking about these sorts of ideas. Thanks very much to Damon Gameau for agreeing to participate in this conversation. Now, Damon has insisted that I read my essay or a version of it to get the ball rolling, because I imprudently, in an email that I forgot about, said that I would do that. So I'm being kept to my word. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Swivel. I'm a councillor here on Byron Shire, principal of Barefoot Law. I've written different things and done all sorts of stuffs. This is Damon Gameau, filmmaker, campaigner, storyteller. But to me, of course, the man who played Greg Chappell in How's That? The Kerry Packer War. And I thought it was definitely your best work. You've tailed off a bit lately, but I'm sure you can make a comeback with more sports-themed content in future. But what are you actually working on currently, Damon?
Chappell the biopic, the early years.
Myopic biopic.
Yeah. I am doing a couple of things. I'm doing just finishing a beautiful film, actually, probably the best project I've ever done, which I took a group of 11 to 13-year-olds from 8 different countries, and I drove a yellow school bus across Europe with these 8 kids, and they're all young, passionate sort of environmental advocates, and we swam in glacial lakes in Switzerland, and we picked berries in Belgian forests, and then they got to meet the CEOs of Nestle and Decathlon and IKEA to basically get them off the streets where they're frustrated and get them into the boardrooms. And they were so eloquent and beautiful and insightful with these leaders that then they formed this idea of a future council and then invited 1,000 other children that had auditioned for the film. And then I just sat back, and now they're running this council, which we're trying to raise money to, really boost it, but they're talking to different corporates around the world, and the sense of empowerment they're getting, and some of these companies are already making changes based on the recommendations that the kids are doing. So that's coming out early next year, but I'm just finishing the grade on that now.
Fantastic. Okay. And now if people want to learn more about what Damon does and the extraordinary projects that are being fostered, if you like, by your outfit, go to the website, theregenerators.org.au. Yeah. And there's loads of content there, loads of interesting materials, and you can see the impact that Damon's work is making here and around the world. And I really am hugely appreciative that you've supported the project. You could only make it today. I thought we'd build up to our conversation with you, but it's worked out, I think, perfectly to start instead with you. And it's it's an interesting experience for me, because when I set up Barefoot Law 5 or 6 years ago, I ran a small course with Byron Community College, and it was on non-profit law, and we did case studies of different projects that people were working in or planning, and I think Andy's here tonight, Andy Hamilton, who was there during that course. And in any event, at the end of that session, I said, well, I've got a project. We might call it Barefoot Law. Here's what it looks like. And that was an experience, an adventure with Byron Community College that kind of changed my life, or determined what I did for the next few years. And I think it's really important to support the work that the college does, and there's a lot of new propaganda that the college has rolled out at immense expense. And I think you need to respond to that by coming to all of our talks. There are 8 of them. This is the Spruik. Colleen Ryan, who's here tonight, is with us next week. I'm not sure if we're going to be in this room or where we'll be next week, so stay tuned. But Colleen used to edit the Fin Review, and we're talking about money matters and how an understanding of economics is essential to democracy. There's another essay on that I've written out there for everyone to read. And I guess before we get into the content, it's worth emphasising that I did economics and history at university, and the theme of, along with law, And so in some respects, this is about me getting back in touch with all of the academic influences of my early life. And it's funny how everything comes around, you know, how the snake eats its tail. And I'm really feeling that strongly now. And getting back into reading people like Mariana Mazzucato in particular, you get in touch with the best energy of the time in my life when my brain was exploding. I ended up doing criminology for the first few years out of university. There's a whole other part of my life that really has nothing to do with what I do in Byron Shire. But the thing is that ideas and storytelling are critical, and it's why I want to give Damon as much opportunity tonight to talk, but I want to emphasise that Damon has insisted that I read this essay. Are we sure that we want to do this?
Well, you could do an abridged version to set the context.
Okay. See? Backsliding already. You do well on council.
A sentence. Just do a sentence.
Just do a sentence. Okay. Pick a sentence, any sentence. Well, right, like the full version will run for about 50
paragraph.
You're taking it back already. Okay. Here we go. So, mate, it's a pity we don't have the worm, Damon. Like, if we could study the worm and get a sense of how it's playing.
People could just yell out. They could heckle when they're done.
It's Mullum. They'll let us know. Okay. All right. So, crisis, what crisis? We need to break the glass. But how? We have emergencies in climate, equality and governance, so profound that we are called to act with urgency and unity. Yet, our institutions are uniquely ill-equipped to deal with the challenge. Our people rightly distrust government, and everywhere we see polarisation and rancour. To respond, government itself needs to be rethought and regenerated. Without that fundamental shift, we will struggle locally, nationally and globally to create a just and fair democratic future. Now, this conversation series aims to connect us with the ideas of those who inspire me, from economists like Mariana Mazzucato, Kate Raworth, who I know Damon's a big fan of, and John Kenneth Galbraith, who lectured us at Sydney University, to future thinkers like Ari Wallach, Carlotta Perez and Grafton Tanner. Who's heard of Grafton Tanner? Well, he's an unfeasibly young American academic philosopher, and I commend to you his extraordinary book, Foreverism. Anyway, there's a little... Am I allowed a digression? Okay, thanks. Okay. So our world in 2024 is disabled by war. Russia in Ukraine, Israel in Gaza, Yemen, elsewhere. The conflicts and the details of killings are endlessly contested. The fog of war is our ordinary daily news, and there is no guiding hand to lead us out of this abyss. Our institutions, the UN, NATO, the World Court, struggle for impact because the primacy of universal human rights is not held sacred. I find myself unable to comment on these things in social media or in public anywhere because social media in particular seems too slight for the horror of what we're discussing. I can't express in short form what I actually think. But to me, the current violence marks the end of our brief democratic era. I hope that it presages a new epoch, but I seriously think that we are in a period of transition that we don't quite understand. Now, I visited Russia, and democracy has never taken root in that country. Israel is a grand corrective project turned terribly sour, a bold solution to the 20th century's great crime that now eats its own tail. Its own government fails to learn the searing lesson of its dominant culture's own recent genocide. So, how do we come from this moment dominated by war? Why is there no reflex sense in our politics that the only way is peace? A peace grounded in a vision of human rights and human flourishing based on our common, irreducible, shared humanity. That should be our harbour. Yet we wallow in repetitive, aimless combat. Locally in Australia, AUKUS, at the same time, casts its shadow over our own politics and government. We plan to build submarines that won't come for well over a decade, and we discovered even yesterday, may not even own. We pay tribute, like a medieval vassal, to the Americans and British, whose decline we somehow prop up with political and financial support. Now, why do we accept such terms when we cannot spend at that scale in tens of billions to address the obvious problems besetting our young and poor and excluded? AUKUS epitomises how the macro politics of the world and the policies of our domestic governments have detached from the ordinary life of people as experienced by the vast majorities of those in our democracies. Our climate emergency is here. We know the facts, but change is far too slow. Protest is marginalised and is getting exhausted. How can people combine to respond more effectively? Our inequality emergency is here. Most youth, even in wealthier countries, can only dream of owning a home. The young are pensioners on the affluence of the old. The motivation for young people to participate in the economic system we've created is unclear to me. We somehow barely seem to see the political implications of the punishing structure we have created and overlook the mental health impact of the punishing competitive hierarchy that we've created for all, but especially the young. What is love in our modern workplace? Do we still aim for development in less well-off countries? The data on inequality, if you read Thomas Piketty, across the world is within our wealthier countries and between wealthier and poorer. But do we understand what it means, and do we care anymore? Our governance emergency is here. It's almost impossible to watch. I've been glued to the news since I was a kid. Even I have practically turned off. We used to have a politics that was a series of honourable arguments. How should government involve itself in the economy? How should the state involve itself in our lives? What kind of future should we make for ourselves? But our politics are not like that now. It seems somehow to be reduced to a series of trivial arguments trapped in a suspended present, all set against world events that are so intractable it overwhelms our private hearts. To me, it's as if the future has been reduced to an afterthought rather than the one true subject of government itself. And we scour our feeds for inspiration like prospectors panning for gold. We see glimmers, exciting achievements overseas, the things Damon talks about and effectively promotes effectively. All of these great things are happening. And let's face it, for all of the doom that I'm outlining here, it's actually the best time for human beings to have ever been alive. There are paradoxes everywhere. And yet, social media descends into silly invective, a chaotic expression of fears and anxieties, an addled identity-based politics, a cacophony of personal brands leading us nowhere. One of the big themes of these conversations is government itself. And to me, government has lost its purpose and method. We've allowed it to shrivel during my lifetime. Its declared purpose has been to get out of the way of the market, the private sector. We live now in a maze of outsourcing, contracting, privatising, consulting, and blame-shifting inquiries. The power and capacity of government has been diminished and marginalised, and deliberately so, since the 1980s when Thatcher and Reagan and the ideas of Hayek and Friedman won the so-called intellectual war. It's a gigantic act of self-harm and self-loathing that needs correction, because we are the government, or at least it's a mirror of us. The markets and mere money will never solve our problems and respond to emergencies. As Mariana Mazzucato reminds us, we need to remember the grand achievements of past government to construct our futures. And she talks about that in her book, The Mission Economy, which I would commend to everyone. Government is, well, as the expression of the will of all of us, directed to the simple problems of life, is the only method of guiding us from the reef in which, or the reef that we're stuck in. Government must return to centre stage to orchestrate the future, working with the people and partners across the economy and civil society. As I say, these conversations have the role of government at its heart, from discussing sovereign citizens who defy the law with David Halpin, to TGA approval of psychedelics with Mika Lerner, or arts policy and funding, which we'll look at with Lindy Lee, to recognition and treaty after the failure of The Voice, which we'll discuss in the last session with Julianne Schultz and Belle Budden, our sustainable green future, and the delivery of housing, and the fundamental role of economic thought in human affairs. And the conversations explore a vision of active, collaborative government. That's the key, collaborative government, responsive to the needs of ordinary people. Now, of course, this sounds wildly naive, but all of the people I'm reading and all of the books that I'm buying that are there for people to feast on all deal with that theme. The revival of government, orchestrating, collaborating, is fundamental. The pandemic response across the world for all of its problems shows how government can intervene and lead, whether delivering health programs or managing our economies. The DARPA program in the US, we have no internet without DARPA, and even the vaccines extraordinarily came out of DARPA, or a DARPA funding environment. But we need to reflect on and understand, frankly, what government has done in the past, to see how government can accelerate the work that we're doing on climate change and with inequality. We could drift, of course, into dystopia, and many would say we're already there, and play out the politics of the past, or move towards protopias, ways of imagining our futures and working together towards them. Radicalism today is about the bravery to imagine a tenable future for everyone on Earth. To me, the starting point must be the opposite of self-interest. My view of where we are as a species is that we've become addicted to self-interest as the sum total of our humanity. I don't see us like that. We speak vaguely, though, these days about the public interest. What does it mean? How many kids of ours can explain that basic concept of democracy? Can we even imagine what the public interest is now as communities, as countries, as species? I do not know the answer to that question, but I know that we must be able to answer that question, to articulate an answer if we are going to act on the emergencies of climate, inequality and government. We need a solid, clear and practical idea of who we are beyond our individual selves and family units. So who are we? What shall bring us together? How does a naturopath in Billinudgel connect to a FIFO worker in Kununurra? How does a garment worker in Bangladesh connect with a Mozambican fisherman, or a trans plumber working in Milwaukee? how does that person see themselves as fundamentally the same as a laundress in Shanghai? In our time of fevered disputation, we need to see that the differences between us are shallow and vanishingly small. It seems to me that that must be our launch pad and the core lesson to teach our children and ourselves. The old language of human rights is the answer. Human rights, of course, are things that we all share because of our shared humanity, our mere vulnerable state of being human. The foundation of how we can come together, how we can recognise similarity, respecting difference, but seeing that we all stare into space or the barrel of a gun in exactly the same way. So let's explore this. The first emergency to solve is in governance. How can we foster a belief in its creative power? What is the process for transformation? How do we take hold of all of our institutions in formal government, but also elsewhere, in companies and schools, in organisations and public authorities? We need government that rules for everyone, for all of us in our diversity and differences, powered by a clear vision of who we are, directed by and to a vision of the future. Empowered government, that is, empowered to orchestrate our society and economy, respecting each type of person in their subjectivity because of our common humanity, aiming above all to improve ordinary life for as many people as possible all over the world and for all living things on this earth. So, let the conversations... That's the short version, and thanks for editing. The 759-page version of that essay is available somewhere on Substack. Anyway, so there you go. So it's a vision, if you like, of government orchestrating our society, directed towards a vision of the future, which we're no longer apparently working towards. What is the future other than dystopic, terrifying, underwritten by, powered by a vision of universal human rights. So now you get to talk for the rest of the hour, Damon. And what we'll do is talk for as long as feels right, and then we'll throw to questions and we'll see how we go. And we will have a drop-dead stop at 8 o'clock, but, you know, we'll probably be pretty amped up and ready to keep talking, but I'll stop talking right now. So, Damon, your thoughts, please.
Thought the middle section dragged a little. I think you could cut a couple of bits in there. No, it was excellent, mate. Thank you. I'm a bit hoarse, by the way. I've just been recovering. I mean, gosh, it's where to start. The things that stood out to me were you separated climate, government, and inequality. And I think those things are deeply linked. And I'll tell a quick story. Some of you might be aware of this, but in 1955, a man named Anthony Fisher in the UK, who was born into a wealthy mining family, he just got back from the war where he'd seen his brother killed by Nazis. And he returned home to the UK. It was a Labor government at the time, and they were in the process of nationalising their coal and oil and gas and their rail and their airlines. And shock horror, because he'd just been fighting the Nazis, he thought and feared that the UK would be slipping into this kind of form of socialism. And so he reached out to Friedrich Hayek, who some of you might know had written a book called The Road to Serfdom and started this group called the Mont Pelerin Society, who basically were on a mission to have a radical free market and just eviscerate any kind of government intervention. And he went to Hayek and he said, I really want to get into politics to enact change. And Hayek said, no, don't get into politics. The real way to influence is to get yourself a think tank. If you want to sway public opinion, academia, students, get a think tank. that's the way you're going to win the war of ideas. So he starts up this Institute of Economic Affairs, the IEA, in the late 50s. And of course, the fossil fuel industry at the time, they don't want their assets nationalised, so they start funding the IEA. And BP, Rio Tinto, Shell, all the big ones start to play. At the same time, in America, a man named Edward Teller is addressing the American Petroleum Institute, which is the peak body for coal, oil and gas, about the dangers of climate change. This is 1959. And he tells them that you have to get off, we have no oil-powered cars by 2000 if we want to avert the main dangers. So that's happening. Then Rachel Carson brings out Silent Spring around synthetic chemicals. The hippie movement's in full swing, of course. Then a series of environmental things happen. The first UN conference happens in Sweden. There's the Limits to Growth book comes out. And suddenly Fisher gets these phone calls from all these people in America, like the Koch brothers, and they fly him out and say, we want to expand this think tank network. And if you look at the minute that public awareness grows around environmental issues, up pops the Cato Institute, Heritage, Fraser in America and Canada. In fact, Fisher even came to Australia in 1976. He was brought out by John Bonython, who was the founder of Santos Gas. And John Bonython said, these think tanks are great because they allow us to say things that we wouldn't say ourselves. And so then you get Fisher pooling all these think tanks together into what he called the Atlas Network. This is in 1981, which then led to Thatcher's policies, Reagan's policies. I think Thatcher even thanked the IEA in her acceptance speech. And then Rupert Murdoch comes into play around that time where he goes to Reagan and says, look, I'll endorse you if you undo this thing called the Fairness Doctrine, which said in America, if you have a point of view on live television, you have to have the counter-argument there at the same time so you get a balanced perspective. Reagan agrees to undo that. This starts this whole Fox empire, which are working in cahoots with the Atlas Network, oil and gas billionaires, and they had 40 organisations in 1987. They now have over 500 organisations. And so when we talk about environmental policy, we talk about climate policy, public health policy, it hasn't been a failure, it has been defeated. And these monsters, to be honest, have eviscerated all the things we hold dear and we value. And so I think underneath that, there is a form of the system that can function quite well, but they have been as good at polluting the information environment as they have the atmosphere and the oceans. And so we get the sense that everything's unravelling and income equality, but this has been a deliberate act. And that was their mission, that was Hayek's mission right at the beginning. How do we break trust in government? How do we accumulate more wealth and power? And, as you said, create more inequality. And so, unless we start to see, and I must emphasise that this is not a right-wing ideology, neoliberalism was picked up by all parties now. And so all our governments are captured to a degree by this same ideology. And it's a story, and that's my thing that I love, is that we are telling a collective story about how we interact with each other in the living world, and that story is coming to an end, and we can all feel it. And it looks like geopolitical tensions, it looks like cost of living crisis, it looks like mental health. Climate is feedback from the planet telling us the story isn't serving us anymore. And so I feel what an absolute privilege to be alive at this moment in all the history of space and time, that we get to plant the seeds and be the pioneers to start telling, writing chapters, writing sentences, playing a character in the new story for humanity. And that generations from now, 300 years, will look back at this time and go, far out, imagine being alive then. Like they were trying to transition their entire energy system. Agriculture was shifting, material resources, they had all this stuff going on, but people were going, no, we want something different. This is not who we are. This is not how we want to interact with each other. And what we don't want is, let's be honest, psychopathic, sociopathic leaders, largely men, that get put there because of the perverse incentives of the system, then get to set the rules of the game of which we all have to be subservient to. Like, that's insane. And in fact, if you look at early anthropologists and the systems that many hunter-gatherer groups operated within, if often a young man had those psychopathic or sociopathic traits strolled back to the tribe carrying the big, hunt. They were ridiculed, they were ostracised. The Lakota even killed them sometimes, or they were sent into the forest for 4 days to sort their shit out. Because they knew it would destabilise the equilibrium of the group. We make them president. We make them the CEO. And then let them encase themselves with all these policies and mechanisms to protect their power. Like, it's a psychosis. That's insane. The least we should be doing is psychologically profiling the leaders of the world with access to all this nuclear arsenal. But we don't even think of that, because we're in this story. We're operating in a story we're not even aware is a story.
Well, that's the key thing, though, isn't it? The story that you're talking about is not really a narrative that most people have in them. That's not the lens through which, like, people might feel the effects of that story, but from the inside, what those think tanks have achieved is not common knowledge. And I guess that's part of these conversations, is to dredge this stuff into the public domain. And I did say along the way there that, and that this is the other thing, right? One of the things, to briefly digress into a bit of local commentary, one of the things about the local penchant or taste for conspiracy theory is that you don't need conspiracy theory to understand the real structural inequity of the world. And in like a few minutes, you've sketched out really the truth of my adult life and what's happened while my generation has benefited from all of the great things of the second half of the 20th century, where we took for granted that the social democratic experience that we had with, I'm 58 on Sunday, by the way, thanks very much, the free education that I got at really good, well-resourced public schools, including Sydney High, Sydney University. I ended up paying 1 year of HECS at the end. But the point is that slowly improving society with, sure, the horror of suburbia, but essentially a more prosperous society with a good ABC that was still adhering to the fairness rule, to invoke that principle. But all of that benefit has been thrown away, and so much of the work that has undermined the achievement of the second half of the 20th century, which was a response to the Second World War, a response to communism, and an effort really to, at the time, believe it or not, resolve the contradictions and the atrocity of the colonial period. But instead, we went in the other direction entirely and decided to colonise our own people and then expand that system using a global, well, we now have a global supply chain, which demonstrates vividly that the process is practically complete. And just one image to share with you before I throw back to Damon. I'm just back from visiting my son in the UK, and every now and then, driving around the motorways, which is unavoidable over there, you pass one of the massive Amazon warehouses. Now, I'm not quite sure that the English language has a word that can capture the magnitude of an Amazon warehouse. And sure, it's an amazing achievement, and we end up with the convenience of well-priced goods delivered to our door. But those warehouses may contain lots of underpaid, ununionised workers distributing goods. But what that warehouse really contains is the hollowed out, denuded and destroyed town centres of all of our countries. And that's a process that has happened with no voting, no discussion really, as it was happening. And so I think that's another inflection point. I reckon that the AI revolution, which we're just about to experience, and everyone probably winces. There will be certain muscles contracting at the mention of AI. And I know that when I mentioned the AI project at the Department of Planning to Shannon Burt the other week, she did not smile at me, put it that way. But I think that it is an opportunity to break things open, because it's a call to ask us, who are we, how do we want to live? And as you say, if you look back at the huge shifts in human history, so many transitions were never able to be anticipated. So the workers lining up on the Hungry Mile in Sydney, where Barangaroo is now, they didn't imagine that a generation later they'd be living in suburbs and driving family cars and living in red brick houses. But they were. You know, the people who decamped from the civil war in China with the Kuomintang to Taiwan did not imagine that that little island would become the epicenter of the computer revolution. So many examples. So, Damon, in the midst of all of that, getting back to your narrative, how do you see government as even capable of transformation with the influence of think tanks and the dysfunction that you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, they've been beaten and they're up against a very clever, well-orchestrated, well-funded machine. But there are glimmers of hope. I think, I mean, especially I've been thinking what happened in our last election here. I mean, the fact that we had as many independents as we did cut through said to me somewhere people were disillusioned with the two-party structure and were sick of decisions being made by people that don't live in their jurisdiction or by a transnational corporation. So how can we get someone that we know and trust to represent our voice? And that's why Jenny, that ran the RSL, suddenly said, I'm going to go to Parliament, and she's there. And then even what some of those independents are doing now in terms of bringing in their local constituents to teach them democracy, experience Parliament House. To me, that's a beautiful example of regenerative democracy. Like, how do we do things differently? But globally, I think if you're looking for the best case example, it was probably, you mentioned Taiwan, which just reminded me. They had a really interesting story in 2015. They had a big protest. It was called the Sunflower Movement, and a group of activists went and sat in their Parliament House. And they actually live streamed, set up cameras and screens to stream the protest to people around the country. And they ended up getting hundreds of thousands of people watching it. And a year later, they had an election, and the president, who came in, the prime minister, sought out the lead activist, a woman named Audrey Tang, and said, I want you to be our digital minister, and I want you to revolutionise our democracy because we're sick of the old ways. And so she embarked on this extraordinary project they've called Radical Transparency, where they publish the government budgets every day. They live stream policy discussions. Anyone can tune in. Twice a month they do a petition where if you get more than 5,000 votes for your petition, the government will debate it and discuss it, live streamed as well. They have this annual presidential hackathon where they invite people to come up with ideas that the government might think are appropriate. They choose 4 a year. They put investment behind them, make them policy. And I think brilliantly for the environment is Audrey Tang partnered with the Environment Minister, and they put out these 13,000 microsensors around the country in all the waterways and particularly in industrial areas. And the residents have an app that they can monitor the safety level, like low chemicals in the water and the airways. And the idea is they then get alerted if there's a breach. And they've had hundreds of millions of dollars in fines, and it's incentivized all the companies to start cleaning up their pollution. And the idea is that it doesn't matter which political party is in, water and air should just be a non-negotiable politically. Let's rely on the data, and the residents love it. So if anyone, I mean, it's worth reading what they're doing, because it just makes me feel, I mean, I know we don't trust tech and we shouldn't trust tech, but again, it's the incentives of that tech, and if it's used carefully and with the right values, it can actually do something pretty extraordinary for us potentially in the future. So I think they are a shining light of what democracy could be in a more decentralised governance, transparent kind of mode. But yeah, we've got to, I don't think enough people understand these nefarious actors that have been eviscerating government, as I said before. So that's another big part. How do we raise awareness? How do we teach people to spot their tactics? Because once you learn about them, I've been deep diving for a while now, it's just so obvious what they're doing. And you see that even what happened here in the voice and the language they used and even the tactic of choosing Jacinta Price, Warren Mundine. This is exactly what they did in Canada 5 years before. They choose 2 prominent Indigenous voices and then they labelled the rest terrorists. And this is all funded by Atlas because they knew that the land rights was the greatest threat to their mining assets. So they did this in Canada and then literally they repeated the template here. And now they're in New Zealand trying to undo the Treaty of Waitangi. Like, this is how grotesque these people are. Like, it's not enough to induce economic policy. They want to rewrite constitutions. And that goes right back to Chile as well. That's what they did with Allende. So this is what we're up against. And unless... And again, you know, I do a lot of meetings with progressives and people trying to get environmental change, and let's just chuck up another graph, or surely people will get it with this fact. And it's like, guys, we are up against the most potent storytelling machine that is espousing, they're so good at it, it's freedom. It's all dressed up as freedom. You just say freedom and those people will come running. But it's freedom from regulations for big pharma, big fossil fuels, all these companies. That's what their freedom is. They don't give a shit about human beings. But they've created a brilliant narrative that invites people in who wouldn't want freedom. I mean, what a great selling point. And here we are going, yeah, but the data says that this graph, it's gone up 2 degrees and anthropogenic and net zero. People go, what the fuck does net zero even mean? What do I do with net zero? What do I do with anthropogenic? I might go to this freedom group over here. So we've got to tell a much better story. And we've got to alert people to what we're actually up against.
Well, that's it. And it's interesting to hear about the idea of freedom from, because the story that needs to be told is freedom with each other. So as ever, it's all about prepositions, right? But the Canadian writer Naomi Klein talks about right-wing politics in the US, as ugly as it is, often being wrong about the facts or the policy, but being right about the feelings. And essentially, like Hollywood and the entirety of Western entertainment, which you've played a small part in, you know, is all about building up that idea of individual freedom, you know, the zenith of its achievement, things like Braveheart, but laced through everything is this idea of individual freedom.
Yeah, but there's a childishness to it, isn't there?
Absolutely,
because
but it works, is my point.
Yeah.
So the feelings are gotten right, but at the same time, just quickly to round the thought out, you've got the famous barn raising scene in Witness. And that's a collective activity, and everyone remembers that. And you remember that because it kind of stands out as this weird anomaly. But I think that's the story. And I'm not suggesting that we all convert to Amish religion, but it would be fun. And around here, those buggies would handle the potholes better than many four-wheel drives. But seriously, what's the outline of the story that we could and should be telling?
Well, I think if we look at the old story, what are the metaphors of that? Their domination, their extraction, their hierarchy. And I think, let's digress for a second. I think we've built an entire civilization off a wound, like a deep wound that we don't even recognise. That, you know, researchers look at this pivotal moment when we move from a hunter-gatherer society into an agrarian culture, that 2 things happen. The first was we changed our dynamic in how we relate to nature. We start yoking the oxen and ploughing them with the field, and if we don't, our neighbour does, they get a caloric surplus, so we're incentivised to treat the animal differently. But then when we go from hunter-gatherer into hoarding, we move from abundance into fear. And when we go into fear, we elicit scarcity, and then we amplify ego and othering and hoarding and dominating, and then we move into the hierarchies and the fiefdoms and the kingdoms and the tribal warfare, right up to monopolies and even what we're seeing today play out. And then religions come in, obviously similar effect, an other that's outside us because we're not worthy. And then the scientific revolution, for all the great things it did, suddenly we develop a superiority and a separation from nature. We can look at it through a microscope. And Francis Bacon, you know, father of modern science, we must hound nature, put her in constraints. enter and penetrate her every hole and corner. I mean, that's the story we've built this society on. It's little wonder we're raping the divine mother. And so I think at a very core level, and I think Paul is here tonight, we had a beautiful experience a few months ago of going to an all-men's retreat, 100 men, and watching these men own their failings and where they've let their children down or their wives down. And watching, it just hit me like how broken so many people are in the world, not just men, but how many of these broken men are our leaders. Like Elon Musk, for fuck's sake, he's a wounded boy. And yet our young boys are looking up to him. Or the Andrew Tates of the world that are just like treating women like shit. They are the mentors of our young men right now. And so we are objectifying the women in our own lives and women in general, but we are objectifying the planet, the divine, precious woman. And I think if we're going to talk about what the new story is, we have to heal that word. It has to come from a healing. Because all this tech we're inventing, we're trying to fix the problem. None of it's going to work. Because we're so out of balance with the natural law. We talk about law and freedom. Nature's free, but it adheres to a set of principles so it can coexist. We've chucked all that out because of our hubris, because of our ego and our wound. Like, we've got to create more. I need more billions. I need more followers. I need to buy more stuff, which is climate change. It has to start with some kind of mass ritual, healing, rite of passage, whatever you want to call it, in our education system. So our kids feel enough. And they, yeah.
That's actually one of the key themes of a show that's on PBS in the US, R.E. Wallach's Brief History of the Future. His core idea actually is that we need to reconcile with ourselves. So I think you're on the money there. Bit of a collab coming up with Ari, but you know, it's interesting to me too, looking at where I grew up in Sydney and seeing what's happening in and around Little Bay and La Perouse, and Aboriginal classmates from La Perouse Primary School are now doing family fishing of Botany Bay, which they weren't doing when we were at school. They're doing black markets at Bear Island and at Barangaroo, which they weren't doing when I was at school. So there is healing happening in a real practical way. And it interested me that those sorts of stories, which, you know, I tried to, you know, propagate during the Voice referendum, just got drowned out by the sort of industrial barrage of negativity. And again, it was the discourse of freedom, you're absolutely right, that was peddled by those nefarious interests. But you can see, it's really a question, I guess, of threading together all of the disparate bits of fabric that are out there into a quilt to capture this moment. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, people said to me, what are you doing with this series? And I thought, well, I'm just making a start. I'm going back into the stuff that I read at university to fire myself up again. I'm running a course to maybe create a new thing for me to do, but really also plugging into the ideas that we need to discuss, and not just the story we need to tell, but the story we need to understand of the truth of our species. Like, there is such epic dishonesty at the heart of our culture. We talk about disinformation like it's the exception. It's not. It's at the very heart of our civilization, and all of the mythologies of post-colonial society are fundamentally dishonest. And I guess that dishonesty is a function of, and perhaps feeds, the wound that you're describing, and even dealing with clients, like the carapace of dishonesty that people in family law disputes try to comfort themselves within. It's there every day, and I guess that's a fractal of the whole that we're living in. But the point of this conversation and your work is that you can teach. It makes sense to talk like this, just as it made sense to everybody in the 70s to provide tax advantages to investing in film. Why don't we provide tax advantages to invest in good things, in the Green New Deal that we need to execute to transition to a post-carbon economy? Why aren't we doing that? And why aren't we, instead of watching Sky News or even, let's face it, the now tedious insiders of a Sunday morning, where's the succour, the comfort, let alone the inspo there? It's not there. It's such a narrow conversation. We need to talk about real ideas powered by real thinkers. We need to play with the tax system in a much bolder way than Ken Henry suggested.
That is the silver lining to the situation we find ourselves in, and I've noticed it even in my work that these kind of conversations aren't as radical as they were even 5 years ago because of everything we've been through. As I said, everyone can feel that the system isn't working for us. That's not a big concept for some people, unless you're a very narrow, Steven Pinker kind of acolyte. But it's people can feel that it's not right, and they are concerned about their children's future. So we have this opportunity in this moment, and this is the great challenge: is how do we galvanise at a time when we're so polarised, deliberately, and tribalised? I mean, I had this incredible experience recently. I was lucky enough to go down to Antarctica for 3 weeks. And Antarctica in itself is a different conversation, the beauty and the sacredness of that place. But I was on a boat with 150 people trapped for 3 weeks. And it was sold to me as a sort of a environment. Well, it could have been actually a very disturbing one. But it was sold to me as like an environmental stewardship, and it would be some transnational, CEOs. But they didn't sell all the tickets. And so they invited a whole group of really interesting people, like a lot of sort of business entrepreneurs, American sort of self-help, millions of followers on Facebook. And I did this talk on the opening night in the boat, and I could just feel the room. Oh, that's not as receptive as normal. And I showed one of the clips, a very short clip of the children that I just took, and it's a scene where the children are kind of expressing their fears about the future, and it's pretty harrowing. They're bawling their eyes out. And this woman just stood up and said, "Stop, stop, stop, stop. Like, you should be ashamed of yourself." And she said, "That is child abuse, and that young girl should be at home, I kid you not, playing with her Barbies." And but it was a really interesting moment because I had to hold that for her, and then a couple of other people piped up and said, "This climate stuff is a load of bullshit." And it was about 30% of the room didn't believe it was real. 3 people on the boat were flat earthers that were going to Antarctica to find apparently there's a giant ice wall at the end of the world. And lots of other, but what was great was that we couldn't go anywhere. We were in the Drake's Passage on the way to Antarctica, and I couldn't just delete Facebook and ignore them. And as fate would have it, I got up the next morning. I was the first to get a coffee at the little cafe, and this woman walks around, and she's the second awake. And I said, "Oh, well, this is perfect. Let's just sit and work out how you got to standing up and yelling at me." And I did that with probably 10 people on the boat. And it was staggering to them how much we aligned, how much, some of them were Trump supporters. And again, fed up with the system, don't think it's working, disgusted by our politics, thinks it's all corrupt. I was like, me too. Like, come on. Let's actually find a way, because how fucking potent would we be if we did that and combined our powers? But we just constantly being told that you're in 2 different camps. And it's like, well, hang on. This neoliberal story isn't serving any of us. So that's the opportunity, I think, the fragility of the system. There's nowhere to hide for it. We saw that in COVID. It's so wound tight, so maximised for efficiency that when something slightly small goes wrong, there's no slack in it. It's not robust. And I think everyone went, hang on a minute. And then we saw this enormous shift of money again, and all sorts of other things we won't go into. But I think we've got this opportunity, and I think we can all feel that we're probably going to have to go further down the valley before we come up again. And I know from my own life, and I'm sure many people here, when you are brought to your knees and you go through a big emotional moment, that's when things become non-linear and magic can happen, and things, as you said, that we could never predict right now. Who knows what might happen when humanity is on its knees and we have to suddenly reassess our social systems, our democracy and our finance, because right now it's all a bit easy and addictive, and we get that. But we're in for some really tough things in the next 10 years, and we need to be honest about that. And then how do we use that moment to, I think it's what I do, line up these solutions so when that moment does come, it's like, this way, sir. Like, you don't have to go to Walmart and get a gun and build a bunker. You can actually come here and look at all these people that have been doing extraordinary things that can turn this planet around and regenerate all these systems. And so that's why I feel, I said before, what a time to be here and to be in the front row seat to this extraordinary transition. No matter what happens, something is changing in a big way, and we can all feel it.
Beautiful. With the work you've been doing, Damon, with the kids, with the most recent film that you've made, and I love the idea of the yellow bus, which reminds me of Peanuts and Charlie Brown and all the rest of it. Yeah. What did you get from those kids? What was their sense of life on Earth, and did they have a sense of the future? And there's all that natural energy, but what sort of vision of the world and life itself did you get from them?
Yeah, I mean, it was as much a rite of passage for me as it was for them. Like, and you see that in the film. I have such a deep love for these kids, and in fact, we're about to do a big premiere at one of the festivals here, and we're going to fly them all out. They're all coming out. They'll all be watching the film together, and oh man, I tear up thinking about it. They were so emotionally brave, and in expressing, I think, deep fears that we struggle to as adults sometimes, like just letting themselves sit in their fears, terror actually at the future, and the complexity of, like, they don't get why we're not doing more. Like, and one of these, this lady that sort of berated me, there's a young girl in Edinburgh, and she goes out every Sunday and she picks up all the plastics from her beach, and she sometimes has big groups, and then sometimes it's her on her own, and the plastics are getting bigger and bigger, and she just cannot comprehend why people don't do it. And so watching her with the CEO of Nestle, who was giving all these platitudes and trying to say, we're doing it, and she just cut through, and just the common sense of, like, but why? And so I think in this moment, we've also got addicted to this system. We understand the complexity. There's something so beautiful about their ages. And that's why I do think they have a lot to offer in this moment. And watching them with CEOs often know far more. And these kids weren't precocious. We chose ones that were just really eloquent. And we met with this huge European bank. And this young girl from Singapore had read all their climate risk assessment reports, all the EU's reports. And so, just confidentially, this particular bank tried to shut the whole film down because he was so embarrassed by his lack of preparation for these kids. And he went and going, oh, aren't you little cute, you like the environment? And they just, bang. And he was completely, off put. And so we've been negotiating with their legal department to say, look, it's a really bad idea if you run away from a group of kids. You have to lean into this and man up.
Because he needed his PR department to explain that to him.
That's exactly what happened. He didn't know the sustainability elements of his own company, and the kids did. So that's why I'm just so excited for everyone to meet these kids, and just anyone that's seen the film is like, oh, because we underestimate them. Their knowledge of what's going on now, especially environmentally, is off the charts, like far more than most of us can express. And I just think that's our role now as elders, to usher them through and make sure we work with them, but we teach them, what they're going to need, and then let them teach us. And that's why I think the film's just going to be very potent and do really good things, because these kids they're magical, and they're not, people are used to Greta. I think, and she's kicked the door down, and that's fantastic. But these kids are just like honest, vulnerable, gentle children that care deeply about the future. So yeah, it's very exciting. That whole release journey is just about to start. Yeah. So the youngest was 11, and he was Joseph from Indonesia, and he started his own recycling company. So he collects all the plastics from the rivers, and he's got 100 clients. He's 11, and then he uses the money to send kids to school. So he's put like 30 kids through school from his, like, it's just, and 11, and the oldest was 13, and they all had a different skill set, different passions, photography. The Australian girl was named Ruby Rogers, and she's actually Jimmy Barnes's granddaughter, and she expresses her climate grief in song, and she writes these songs and teaches them to the kids in the film, and it's just so like I said, I don't care what happens with this one. We've already had the journey, and it's the proudest film I've ever been involved with. And when it looked like the film was going to be shut down, I rang one of the mothers, and she just said, "Oh, it doesn't matter. Like, Joaquin's had the time of his life. You've changed his life. It doesn't matter what happens from now. It's a bonus." I was like, oh, "Thank you, but no, the world needs to meet your son," and I think they will crack a lot of people open. Yeah.
What's it called?
It's called Future Council.
Future Council. Okay, great.
It'll be out. We'll do a tour of it in Australia probably next Feb. So it's now doing all the festivals around the world. We're just about to start that run, and then we'll do a big tour of the country with get a lot of the children involved, get them on stage as well, and do that next year.
Okay, I think it's probably time for some questions. So how about I play host and charge around with a microphone? So who's got a question for Damon? Up the back. Okay, Tim. Getting my steps up.
G'day. I was just wondering, in Australia, I think is it called the Australia Institute that's sort of the arm of that? I remember reading at one of the previous elections that they had like 32 policies and only one had been rejected by the,
So there's the IPA, which is that was in the 40s, and then there's the Centre for Independent Studies, which is another one that was set up by Bonathan, and then there's one on the left, which is the Australia Institute.
And how do we bring them down?
Well, one of the projects I'm doing at the moment is working with some of these professors here and overseas that have been tracking them for the last sort of 30 years, and so we're actually doing a short film that's coming out in about 2 months. It's a 10-minute piece just to alert, and they've built a whole impact campaign about how people can spot the tactics and what they use and the methodology. And then the idea is to hopefully make a longer doco or a 4-part series, really tracking right back with a whole suite of tools that people can use. And as I said, once you start spotting it, it's really clear to see. Sorry, I'm not sure what it's called yet, but it'll be probably called Atlas, or it's because it's the Atlas Network. So it's worth having a look anyway at the Atlas Network. And there's a professor at UTS in Sydney, Jeremy Walker, who's written a couple of really great papers on them, and also how they influence the voice vote here.
Just coming up the back, getting back to systemic change, Mandy Nolan in the back. Damon, you probably know this quote, but we're talking about systemic change, but we've never said the word capitalism once. We say neoliberalism. You know that quote, it says something like, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world," I don't know who said this, "than it is the end of capitalism." Why do you think that is? Okay, go.
Well, I do think it comes back to that entrenched story that we've got, that it's so ingrained. Most people don't know that we could have a different system, and we have operated different systems. Look, I'm not sure of this, but the conversations I've had with people, I think there is a version of capitalism in terms of trade and a market that might be possible. This is Kate Raworth's work as well, and certainly a version that we transition to before we think about what the new system looks like. So I think people conflate capitalism with what we have now, which is a hyper-capitalism, capitalism on steroids, without any mechanisms to protect life. And so maybe if we found a way to protect life and value it and embed that into the system. I mean, it's funny, I took the kids to this company in the UK. They're a mid-sized company. They're called Faith in Nature, and they make soaps and shampoos, and they're quite large. They distribute around the world. They're the first company in the world to put nature on their board. And so nature gets a vote in every decision they make as a company. And they allocated a group of ecologists and environmentalists to represent. It's a corporate legal binding body. And it's changed their packaging, their supply chains, all sorts of things, because they said, well, nature needs to be in the room in these decisions. And you know, imagine that scales up in 20, 30 years, and big companies are doing that sort of thing. So I don't know, Mandy, I do think there'll be a different system in 100 years from now. But I think, this one will have to probably, and that'll come about after this one really unravels.
Damon, my name's Mick. I'd like to follow Mandy's question in a way, because I'm really intrigued by your optimism. It's quite inspiring, but it accentuates my doubts. And I'll go with a quote too. So 100 years ago, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci said that between the death of the old and the birth of the new falls the morbid interregnum. And he also developed the idea of hegemony, where capitalism is able to grant concessions to ameliorate situations and placate antagonists, but it never goes to the central power of capital. It never goes to property. It never underpins the basis of the capitalist system, creates false consciousness and all those things. So my simple question is this: to get to the new optimistic place that you envisage, do we have to go through a rupture? Do we have to go through violence? And do we have to go through what in the 70s and 80s people called revolutionary politics? Because my great concern is, I've been interested in revolutionary processes, they all seem to fail. Are you confident that we can get through a huge systemic and violent rupture?
I think I would have answered this differently a few years ago, but I don't. No, I do think we're going to be brought to our knees. And I've spoken to Jem Bendell a couple of times. He's written a book called Breaking Together, which, I mean, he's really on the very dark side. But even climate scientists and other people I respect that I've sort of interacted with over the last 10 years, they've all changed their tune. Like, there is a sort of it's challenging. It's a defeatist attitude in a sense. They've surrendered, some of them. It's like, we've tried and we've done all we can, but the inertia and the incentives of this system are so powerful that we're not going to voluntarily step away. I mean, this is the problem again, is this as you said, the constant expansionism of this system that's requiring more energy and more materials every year. Even the renewables we're putting in the system now aren't meeting half of the energy demand of a year. Where does that stop? No government's going to step off of that and go into recession deliberately. No CEO is going to voluntarily lose money for his shareholders. So we're all just playing the game, riding the bike along, and it can't stop. And so the more I've sat with that, I do think, and as I said, I've gone through something recently in my own life, and the only thing that changed my behaviour was a rupture. How bad that rupture is the more interesting conversation for me, because there's the Hollywood narrative version where the fucking streets are burning and we're all shooting each other. Like, I don't know that it's going to, I don't know that we're going to fall off a cliff, but we might go down a slope. And as we're going down that slope, can we think about, like, look what happened in our shire when we went through our crisis, like the networks that formed, the new food systems that spring up, the energy that but there's so many things available for us to slow down and do things differently. It's all there. So will that be forced upon us? Like, so that's, to me, the juicy part. Is it going to be violence and chaos? Maybe in some parts of the world. I mean, it's already happening, and we're lucky here in a lot of ways. But I don't know that we're going to drop off the cliff, but it's going to be a decline.
Yeah, I think we underestimate the commonness of disruption and violence in everyday life now, but also through history and all. Yeah, there are anarchists running through the streets of Manhattan in the early 20th century, throwing bombs at each other, and that's sort of written out of history somehow. And you know, as much as Gramsci has his analysis of capital, you've got people like Carlota Perez saying, well, what's the alternative then? And yes, there's not going to be an end to capitalism, but there are different types of capitalism. Capitalism is not a unitary set thing that is what it was when it began and what it'll be in 100 years' time. But, you know, the literacy that we have, like, you know, we're roughly the same age. We all studied a curriculum based on Marx, right? Now, most people would lapse into cliches super quick about Marx. What does it even mean? You know, and what does Marx even mean now with the way that that labour functions in workplaces? What is the story post-Marx that we tell our own children in a gig economy? I mean, these are the things that we should be discussing in the pubs of Australia. Totally. Oh. Well, they're sure, slightly different point, but yeah, the same thing happened in, you know, Wales, for example, in the UK, or the mining towns. Generations of people haven't worked since the mines closed under Thatcher, and how did they vote on Brexit? They voted to leave the European Union in huge numbers. Sorry, Ruby. Sorry.
Hi there. Now, don't be scared when I say that I've lived with suicide my whole life. And I was sold by the government at the age of 2 weeks old, and I've survived various different things. And nonetheless, I've come to this age where I work in child protection. Everything I think is, I just like to coin this phrase that all this renewables, I actually think children are the greatest renewable. Not solar, not wind, not everything else. I actually feel that children are our greatest renewable because they hold the knowledge, they hold that lateral thinking. I took the government to court at the age of 10 and I challenged them and made myself a ward of the state because I was being terribly abused. And that was lateral thinking, which is what you're saying. I can read the law and go, well, I don't need to understand the law to know that what authority told me isn't in there, actually lying to me. I also feel that we as elders are our greatest resources, not gold, not copper. So I like to think that if we can engage the children's lateral thinking, that they might actually teach us something.
Hi, Damon. Alan here. Just a quick question. Really, you talk about a new narrative, and I totally agree. I think that's exactly what we need. I'm just wondering if you have any ideas of how that new narrative will be spread, because it seems to me that, yeah.
So that's that's probably something we haven't touched on today, but that's one of our greatest challenges is how we heal our information landscapes and regenerate those at a time where we've got such huge collective existential decisions to make, and we're so fragmented. And certainly from my research on these networks, some of them are spending $2 to $5 million a week or a month on pushing out narratives and pushing out these memes. And again, I think through an optimistic lens is that AI might accelerate the demise of that. I think the trust will get so broken with what's coming. And again, that's a bigger conversation. I'm not sure if you're covering that, but what's going to happen with AI in terms of deep fakes in that information space? My hope is that people will just be like, I cannot trust a thing on that thing anymore. And I'm going to put it down over there, and I'm going to go into my community, or we're going to reinvent new ways of sharing information because we almost need this one to burn to the ground before we can change. And And so that's, again, this is why, to the gentleman next to you, that I'm not overly optimistic we're going to voluntarily do that. We're going to need to drive these things into the ground before we actually go, oh shit, what were we doing? A lot of us in here get it already, but the majority of the world are not aware of the story they're encapsulated by. They're not aware of the mechanisms that are keeping them online and tribalised and outraged. It's just their daily life now. And so we've got to snap them out of that reverie. And again, that's what I would say to anyone with kids in particular, like this notion that the culture just isn't our friend, and it is so wired to elicit these limbic reactions, this dopamine, or wherever you go in the system, whatever you eat, whatever you're consuming online. We have to step away. We have to stay engaged, obviously, politically, but especially for our kids, we just have to get them off that system and step away from it. And it's so bloody hard. And I've got 2 daughters of my own. But everywhere you look, it is being engineered to bring out the worst in us. Like, look at Twitter these days. It's creating psychopaths. It's creating narcissists, where it's not, you can't just post a nice comment anymore. No one cares about that. You're incentivized to be as outrageous and provocative as you can. And we're not even aware that we're doing that or seeing what that's doing to us as human beings. And so, yeah, I do think that sense-making space, whatever you want to call that, this is the English historian John Glubb who looked at that and said that he tracked, like Jared Diamond tracked the collapse of civilizations. He looked and he said, no, it was more than just their souls and their resources. He said it was when a society lost a sense of shared values, that's when things fell apart.
That's it.
And that's where we are right now. You know.
That's it. And I guess, you know, you've got those examples of failed societies, and you've really got to go back to the Ice Age for a massive climate-based impact, apart from disease at different points or war. So the question is whether we can take advantage of all of the thinking that's going on right now to voluntarily somehow modify capitalism again. That's my view. And that's one of the things that Colleen and I will talk about next week, are different, the history of capitalism over the last 100 years, the different strains of thought, and how no one, or very few people in our society really speak the language of economics anymore. So that more or less concedes the field to your opponent, to the sorts of people that Damon's talking about with the...
Another glimmer of hope I found recently, that, and some of you will be aware of this, but that a lot of the literature during the Enlightenment period was written in conversation. So it was a dialogue between people. And it just made me think of this moment now and the sudden ramping up of podcasts, sort of like people thirst for conversation. You know, and there's a little spark in there somewhere. Yeah.
Well, you know, and there was the occasional dialogue that Plato and Socrates engaged in too. But so the wireless goes a long way back, you know. More questions? Oh, wait. Yeah, Cass.
Hi. Just at the end of the last century, a famous futurist, Robert Theobald, had a theory of the tipping point for great changes in society. And he actually limited it to 27.3%, which doesn't sound an awful lot, does it? It gained a momentum. So that was the tipping point of a change in society. Any change you wanted to come up with, that was it. I don't know, that doesn't sound so bad to me.
Good odds, you mate.
Yeah.
Anyone else? We're in the last 5 minutes. Yeah.
I've just got... Thank you. My name's Lindy. It's just remaining positive in like I'm a teacher, but also I'm watching all my favorite places just get so destroyed. And like Peter Wish-Wilson, who's our wonderful Senator, Sofa Green's senator, the image of him on the reef was just bleached, and then above the water was like 20 coal ships. I think he was on Heron Island, and he said the craziness of him coming up from under the water and just seeing the line of coal ships. You could hardly see the horizon for the coal ships. And it's just, I find it so hard to every day just working really hard because I'm broke. I'm still in a flood fence. My son has mental health issues, but at the same time, I go to work every day. But I see the logging trucks come past, and I'm fighting for Wallam, and I'm watching our beautiful forest. I'm watching Bob Brown get put back in jail, and what do we do? Like, I'm working so hard. I'm broke. I want to support Mandy and so many others, but how do I do something to make a change when my students actually don't care about plastics and they just want to stare into their phones and they don't really care about politics, and they're suffering because they all got rescued off their roofs in the flood? But what can I do, or what can the small people that don't have a lot of money, work really long hours, what can we do to remain positive and still keep fighting for all the things that we love and what we care about?
Thank you. Yeah. And I think what you did is just as important, like for you to share the grief that a lot of us are feeling and sometimes don't have the courage to, like even that act, the simplicity of that is so important. And I think too right now, parents and teachers are like the frontline warriors to create change. Like the opportunity you have to influence these young minds and help them change the story and empower them. Like what a gift that your position you're in right now. And I would say if you last week actually I'll talk to you afterwards, but we just released 100 free cross-curriculum lesson plans for all year levels and all ages, all on this sort of stuff on regen learning, so the kids can learn about their future. So go and use those. But I just want to tell you a story quickly about a guy named John Stockdale, and some of you might not have heard this story, but he was a vice admiral in Vietnam and he was a prisoner of war for 7 years. And he was the only one in his platoon to make it out. And when he was asked about what it was that got him through, he said that the people around him that were pessimistic and had given up hope, they died very quickly. He said even the ones that were optimistic, they looked forward to the future. They might get released. When that day came and went, their spirits were crushed and they died. He said, I cultivated this deep acceptance of where I was at, as you have just then. The tears of the logging trucks, the coal ships. It is horrific. We are nature. We should be crying at decimation of us. But at the same time, he cultivated this resilience that I will get through at all costs. I will inspire my kids no matter what it takes. And holding those two things together has become known as the Stockdale paradox. And it is the perfect analogy for the moment we're all in. Like, feel the horror of where we're at and be honest about that. Let yourself cry if you have to. Not enough of us are crying. And then that frees up the space for you to move forward, be there for your kids, and think about what influence you're going to have on their lives. And you might change one or two of their lives through your teaching.
We might have time for one or two more. Here we go. Okay. Maybe three.
Thank you. I haven't fully formed my question. I guess I'm curious about the corporate capitalism picture that we're really discussing here, which is the issue of these entities which have no soul and have no, they don't really care about life. And I guess I also wonder about how do we resolve the trauma that we're reproducing these ideologies continuously from, that allow something like Atlas to mar our true vision, and I guess that's the question, is how do we find that healing from trauma that we see continually perpetuated?
I mean, there's a whole hour on that, and I, as I said before, I witnessed a group of 100 men do it a couple of months ago and saw that it's possible and was completely blown away. I was also reading a story yesterday, and I'm not sure if it applied to all clans, but there was an indigenous man talking about how when their children were raised, there was part of the learning was the child had to be aware of their shadow all of the time, and you couldn't let your shadow cross the path of someone else. And so the metaphor was, be aware what you're doing with your dark side. Like, be conscious of it and how it interacts with other people, like in a physical expression of it, but also the metaphor of that. So that's a much bigger conversation about how we, especially with our 16, 17-year-olds, what do we have to do there to help them into adulthood that allows them to face those parts of themselves in a safe space, especially our boys. Are we going to keep creating these same leaders and this same cycle and see what's happening in our country right now with the way that women are being treated? So that is a massive issue. But I think, as I said before, that wound doesn't just affect how we relate to each other. It affects how much we consume, how much we need to acquire, which has a huge impact on sustainability. So it's arguably one of the most important things we've got to get right, is all collectively facing our shadows.
Beautiful. Over here, we had, yeah, great.
Thank you very much. It's been really inspiring and scary, I suppose. The thing that is interesting me the most is the species argument, and all of our discussions seem to be about us. I did a little course some years ago. I can't remember who is the runner of it, but it's called Wild Law, which is the laws of nature. And you were talking about what you could do, and it seems to me that, and I'd really love your comment and Mark's, because he's a lawyer, how would we go about the paradigm shift from human centre, human ownership, mine, as opposed, and where we sit? We all, from what I can hear in this room, we all have a very sympathetic, empathetic connection with nature. It's not shared right across the human species. And the person who sat in that ship going to Antarctica understands but sees the world in a different way than you did. How do we get what we know to be? I mean, Indigenous cultures have known it forever. How do we get the modern societal position to recognise what everybody knows, but is happy enough to go along with the flow of our system without actually changing the system? And what is the system?
I think that comes back to the point we were discussing before, that maybe it's going to take some kind of collapse, that we're going to need to go through something to crack us open and then see how our hubris and see how human-centric we've been. I actually watched the other day, people should watch it. It was the first gathering of Indigenous tribes in the 70s. Some of you might have seen it. It was at the UN. And when the first speakers got up, and I'm not sure what tribe he was from in North America, but he said, we're all here, but who is representing our four-legged friends? Who is representing the birds? And he called it back then. He was like, we're trying to make all these decisions and there's these key elements missing. And so that's why, again, from my perspective, what was so sad about The Voice was that we had an opportunity there to invite a different lens and a different form of governance that has been sustainable for so many years for a reason, because these things were all considered and embedded. So I don't know. I try my bit by telling stories. I think there's lots of that happening now, to be honest. I think it's extraordinary. I mean, some of you might have seen the science coming out now about plants being perhaps more sentient than us and smelling and hearing. That stuff was woo-woo 10 years ago. It's now being taught to our kids, so nature is forcing her way back into our lives and will continue with every more storm and fire. We're not going to ignore her for long. And so maybe that'll shift some of our thinking, and things like this, putting nature on the board, these type of things give me a little bit of hope that something's shifting, but as you alluded to. Whether it's going to be enough, I don't know.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. My name is Marion. I've had a really interesting few weeks, and I've had a really interesting life. I'm one of those sort of canary in the coal mine kind of humans. And I grew up on the back of natural rain, like a national park, yeah? So nature was my first relationship before humans. I didn't really trust humans. I'm working on that one. And yeah, and you know, I'm a mother. I'm really passionate, and my son's studying climate science and then going to transition into earth sciences. He's at Melbourne Uni. You know, he went to Shearwater. He's one of these great kids that, you know, I've put all my, you know, genius into, you know, that he can be one of these future people that you're speaking of. And I'm on that slide that you're talking about in my personal life. I'm like, you know, I'm one of those people that, you know, those things, 4 things that happen in your lifetime, they're the most stressful things that could ever happen. I have about 4 of those a year. So I'm at that kind of real canary in the coal mine. Like, I was at Bondi Junction 3 weeks ago on a Saturday. And right there, you know, like right there, you know, blood, stabbing, running, screaming, the whole thing. So my swimming pool is well overflowing with, you know, all of this nuttiness. So, you know, and I've got all these concepts of watching young men, they get a PlayStation for Christmas. The first thing that comes with it is a game that is a violent game. That comes free of charge with the game, right? The console comes with death, kill, murder. Not creation, not, you know, there's a connection to it. But, you know, I'm seeing that, you know, there's a real hotbed, you know, and the mental illness that is what you've talked about is a mental illness. I'm not asking questions, but I'll get there. The mental illness that is our society, that is the capitalism, that is the greed, the hoarding. And I'm not innocent of any of these things, but I have an awareness and I'm steering the path. I'm making more conscious choices, all those sorts of things. I'm very much in agreement about everything having to come down. I grew up working in media. I was horrified by most of it, and I've worked in independent media since. I'm now doing podcasting. I absolutely love the conversation that we're in, that we're talking about, and I'm finding this one-on-one, this bouncing off, or this group conversation that we're all almost getting more out of it because we're together. We're having this visceral experience with each other in a room. We're getting to experience each other's pain, each other's fears, stresses, our hopes and dreams. You know, we're here together doing this. We're in Mullumbimby, like, you know, we're the thought leaders of our country in many ways here, you know, representing our nature. So I wanted to acknowledge you for turning up, and Mark for making this happen today, and the ongoing conversations that are going to happen. I'm kind of rounding up a finish, but yes, you know, and thanks for holding us with those possibilities. And I don't know if there is a question here, or if there's anything else if there's anything add to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Look, I think it's traditional to, you know, express our appreciation for Damon giving of his time. But I think someone's got a cake. Have we got a cake out the back there? No, we don't. A round of applause instead for... Next week, of course, we dismantle capitalism with Colleen Ryan. So, and that will be a live demonstration, a how-to workshop. So join us. There'll be loads of spamming on social media through the week. I think Marion, so hopefully we'll work out where the venue is. Do you think it'll be here or over at the other venue, Anne? Well, yeah. It will be at the other venue. Okay, which is the old Mullum Mowers place. So, yeah? Yeah, near the community college. So if Thanks, Louise. So we'll send the I don't know if you got the essays already, but we'll send loads of information to you so you can come back. And we look forward to seeing future council and the Atlas project. But I think Marion was right that the point of this is this, and really getting people out and talking like this, and getting kids to do it too. So lots of great ideas. Thanks very much. Thanks again.